From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. K-State's Dan O'Brien will look ahead to next Tuesday's USDA grain supply and demand report, and if those new numbers will likely cause much reaction in the markets during his weekly grain market segment. Also today, K-State's Walt Fick will look at the latest thinking on controlling the spread of Old World Bluestem in Kansas grasslands. That'll be the topic of his presentation at the 2019 Winter Forage Conference, co-sponsored by K-State, also next Tuesday in Wichita. He'll encourage you producers to attend that informational event. And later on, K-State's Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather. All this and more coming up on Agriculture Today.
Kansas farmers and ranchers are helping feed your family in the world. The largest contributor to the Kansas economy is beef cattle. How do you get that juicy steak on your plate? In order for you to enjoy your tasty meal, it requires the hard work of the producers, marketers, advertisers, processors, inspectors, transporters, packers, and consumers. So thank all these people and sit back, relax, and enjoy your tasty meal.
We're glad to have you listening in for another Agriculture Today. First off, the grain markets with our guest in studio, Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Good to have him here in Manhattan today. Dan, we've, among other things to cover, a look ahead to next Tuesday's World Agricultural Supply and Demand Report from the USDA. This is a monthly account, of course, and the markets watch these numbers to see what's happening. But generally, when we look at the overall production and stocks numbers, the expectations are for minimal changes.
Yes, the USDA is not scheduled to go out and do in-field surveys or have a survey of farmers representing December 1st results of what they see, et cetera. And because of that, there may be changes that the USDA would make on the supply side, but it would just be sort of an accumulated realization of something that, quote, is out there. But as far as a NASS crop production report, we're not scheduled to have one for these major crops anyway. That will come in January. January has the potential for the USDA to bring in numbers that for whatever we have finalized in these in-question northern states, and we can talk about that in a minute. Most of the time when there's a survey done in that January report, crops been almost all harvested, no issue at all. It's really thought-provoking. There'll be a December 1st stocks number, and when you look at the northern states, you've got the Dakotas well below normal in terms of what they have harvested for corn. You're looking at North Dakota with 36% of their crop harvested right now. So the rest all sitting in the field, normally 95. So that's a challenge. South Dakota, 80% of their crop harvested. Wisconsin, 66. Michigan, 66. And probably because of just the volume, you look at 3 I states, they have 7 or 8% of their crop still left in the field. And, that's not a large percentage relative to those other northern states, but that's a lot of corn. Right. And, with some of this pretty severe weather we've seen up in those areas, how will, particularly for corn, and there's some soybeans out in those fields as well, how will ears stay on the stalks? If that stocks number represents the expected harvest as opposed to what they have in the bin, you'll almost need a secured versus an unsecured categorization of what we have. So really questions up in the air. If you were looking at what the pattern has been so far for the USDA, it's that and how they've handled these numbers this year, it would be that they're probably not going to declare that the numbers aren't there until they have proof that they're not there. So those crops standing out in the field, I would not be surprised. They'll still count them as coming. But it sure seems that there's some element of this U.S. corn crop this year. Is it 5%? Is it 4%? Is it higher? That's not in yet overall. And it's probably going to be a question that'll hang with us past January out into the first part of next year. I think the thing to remember is last year it took till the September quarterly stocks report for the USDA to have enough evidence to say that, gosh, we overestimated the 2018 soybean crop by about 300 million bushels. So it may take that long for us to get that type of evidence.
As we look ahead to this report, Dan, do you expect any revelations in as far as grain production or stocks from elsewhere in the world? For we're seeing accounts, for instance, that Brazil may well be looking at some record corn numbers.
Yes. The USDA, when they put together the expectations for the 2019-2020 marketing year, those South American crops, Argentina, Brazil, the main ones, those are harvested out there in June. So their expectations now will be based on some estimate of planted acres. And does the USDA know better than what Brazilians know, and CONAB, their marketing groups and exchanges? So I don't want to be just pessimistic on that, but I would think that, if anything, you would not anticipate any shortfall or reduction in South American estimates of production. And really where we're at, they've been planting those crops. The time of uncertainty and challenge for Brazil in the midst of what appears to be, we hear discussions of El Nino systems, which are both good and bad depending on what part of those countries you're in. It would seem that the time of uncertainty and challenge is probably out there into February, March, is when they're more prone to make judgments, USDA is more prone to make judgments about the size of those crops. We've been doing some grain market outlook, talked to the Ag Retailers Association group on Thursday, and discussed with them how, at least for corn, you'll probably see a bounce back to 2018 levels, if not higher. Some analysts are talking 10% increase 5 to 10% increase in corn acres for next year, say 5% for soybeans. And if soybean prices were higher, and if trade negotiations between the U.S. and China bear fruit, and again, such an up and down, uncertain thing, then you could see a shifting around between corn and soybean acreage. But the window for that, what is the window for that? From now through spring, probably. Well, now till we buy the seed, which is probably December, January, February, March.
And on the U.S. grain export scene, tranquil, with one notable exception. You say that the numbers tell us grain sorghum exports have popped to the higher side.
Well, yes, 5.5 million bushels of exports for grain sorghum, which is getting near the really strong days we'd seen when grain sorghum was having those type of numbers and much higher when grain sorghum was going into China. Mm-hmm. So that's really stands out as a great positive for grain sorghum. We'll see if really the issue with them will be sustainability. Are they going to be able to consistently do that? Otherwise, we had decent export movement reported for other crops, about 55 million bushels for soybeans, which is sure welcome. We wish it was about double that. But for corn and wheat, some movement, but what really stands out this week is the movement in the grain sorghum market, and of course that's very welcome in that segment of the Kansas industry.
But no way to tell if that sustainability will be realized.
Got to look out to the purchases down the road and see how many ships it'll take and how many bushels will be called for to fulfill that. When we look at Kansas cash grain sorghum bids, very enticing economically, I would say. If they accomplish pretty near the same thing, that and corn, grain sorghum is seeking value relative to the economic feed value and usage value of the competitive feed grains. And it's not surprising that you'd see some good export movement for it.
Well, Dan, we step a bit outside the box as we round out this segment this week because you have been directly involved in a series of cotton risk-assessed marketing workshops put on by K-State Research and Extension at 4 locations throughout the southern part of the state the past several days. Cotton as an alternative crop, there is interest and a pretty stable level of interest, at least in that part of the state.
Interesting to look at the structure that's been built up down in that area in terms of the number of gins and relatively new gins that are coming into place. The interest from some of the major cotton marketing cooperatives in that area, broad-based support, the relative water usage for cotton under irrigation in some areas that either have declining wells or may have regulatory pressure upon them, again, brings that crop to the fore for consideration. And we're putting together our KSU budgets for 1,300 to 1,500 pounds of cotton per acre yield and using 6 to 8 inches of water. That's pretty good. This is a down year price-wise so far for cotton, and cotton certainly is affected by the U.S.-China trade thing. We grow about 19-20 million units of cotton and export about 16 or 17 of it. So we're an exporter. We're kind of like the Ukraine of the cotton market, and certainly China is a big part of that. So as a result of that, you've seen prices come down from 70 cents on average last year down to about 61, 62, something like that so far. It's just interesting now with Monty Vanderveer, our colleague, is involved in these meetings. Probably the biggest thing that's come out of these set of discussions came out of not so much my cost of production and yield side, but more so what Monty was finding relative to T yields on crop insurance. If you're going to grow this, just like any other crop, it has to be financed. You have to use T yields, and the T yields sure look to be low relative to the expected amounts of production that you're going to look at. So for non-irrigated, we're looking at 800, 900 as a conservative budget number, and the T yields in southern Kansas are 375 to 515. Arguably not in the ballpark. Okay. So that's a negative. And the irrigated numbers, we're looking at 1,000 to 1,500, and the T yields there are 700 to 800. Now, RMA, to their credit, certainly was at these meetings and heard that message. And in their effort to make sure that they're relevant and providing support, I would not be surprised they'll take a look at those.
Just from the 30,000-foot view, though, is cotton likely, as we look to 2020, to be competitive enough to be an alternative crop vis-a-vis our main crops in Kansas, this T yield issue with crop insurance notwithstanding?
The T yield issue undercuts a little bit of the financial support, so it certainly needs to be rectified. But we were showing returns over land costs on these cotton budgets. We weren't counting labor, so in terms of labor and management, other than in the lowest yield scenarios, we were showing positive returns. So that's kind of an eye-opener for an old corn, soybean, wheat guy like me to really wrestle with those budgets and see, gee willikers, there's some returns there.
You can have a look at that information at agmanager.info. Good to have you here, Dan. We'll catch up with you again next week, and many thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
He's a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension, and our regular Friday guest on the broadcast, Dan O'Brien. We'll be back on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. And on this segment, we'll look ahead to an event set for this coming Tuesday, December the 10th, in Wichita. It is the Winter Forage Conference. It's sponsored by the Kansas Forage and Grassland Council in cooperation with K-State Research and Extension. So we bring by Walt Fick, Range and Pasture Management Specialist at K-State, to let us know about what's going to be shared at this conference. Walt, you've been involved with the Forage and Grassland Council in the state for a long while. So before we get into the agenda at this particular event, you might talk about the council and its mission.
Well, the Kansas Forage and Grassland Council has been around, I think it's maybe close to 20 years. Its primary mission, I think, is to serve as an umbrella organization, providing education and programs to strengthen the forage industry in the state of Kansas. It has a variety of people with different backgrounds that have been members and active, including, the typical forage-type groups you might think of, hay producers, farmers and ranchers that produce hay, but also the seed companies that maybe are selling alfalfa varieties. They've been pretty actively involved across the state. The dairy industry to a certain extent. I know we've had tours in southwest Kansas on some dairies. So it's a pretty diverse group, and then people like myself, and I'm more a rangeland person, but the range and forage people in the state, including here at the university.
And the council's keystone event is this Winter Forage Conference every year, isn't it?
It has been. We've changed maybe the time of the year that it's been offered. Sometimes it's been here in Manhattan. I think we've targeted maybe March on occasion, but the last 2 or 3 years at least it's been in this December time frame.
And again, it's coming up this Tuesday in Wichita at the Sedgwick County Extension Education Center, the western part of the city of Wichita. So let's get right into the lineup for this year's Winter Forage Conference. And it's comprised of peers here at K-State as well as yourself, Walt, on a variety of topics.
Yeah, the primary speakers, I think, have been lined up. Jamie Lynn Farney, who's at our southeast station at Parson, is talking about extending the grazing season using cover crops, something she's been working on for a while. Justin Wagner, who's out at Southwest Station, he's also involved in talking about using alfalfa in the cattle industry. And then my presentation will be kind of an update on Old World Bluestem. And I think the other major thing that they'll have there is actually a panel that will discuss grazing techniques to reduce hay cost. So it'll be a full-day program. I think it starts at 9 o'clock in the morning. I think I'm the last speaker of the day, but I think it's supposed to be done by 3 o'clock.
Well, we want to take a few moments here to get a sense of what you'll be passing along in your session at the conference. And it is this invasive species which has been creeping into our grazing resources in the state the last several years, Old World Bluestem. Remind us of just why it has been so formidable in dealing with it.
Well, it's probably been around for some time, and the Old World Bluestem phrase actually covers 2 different species. We have Caucasian bluestem, which is probably the most prevalent, but then there's these yellow bluestems as well. But together we just call them Old World Bluestems, and that's describes what part of the world indeed they're from. I think Caucasian also maybe was somewhat native of Australia, but otherwise, Caucasian, of course, that should remind you of the Caucasus Mountain region in the Eurasia part of the world. But they were introduced into the U.S. and probably here in Kansas, probably dating back to the 1930s, I think, primarily as a forage crop. And they probably didn't expand real rapidly, but today, you drive down highways and roads. These Old World Bluestems have been found in nearly every county in the state. So it's getting to be pretty widespread. The problem that we have with it, if it did get seeded either knowingly or on accidentally as part of a mix or something on the roadsides, it has been expanding then across fence lines into our native pastures. Cattle will graze the Old World Bluestems early in the season, let's say May and June, but then it gets pretty stemmy. Matures quicker than our native warm season grasses. And so if livestock have a choice, at that point in time, they don't utilize it at all. They're going to switch over to the natives. And then, of course, that would allow the Old World Bluestems to probably increase over time.
Can they overwhelm the native species, though?
They can. There's situations, usually it starts, you'll have little patches that somehow got started in a pasture, maybe the size of a room or smaller. But left untouched, not doing anything with it, it will expand and take over, probably from both a competitive standpoint, and I think it spreads primarily by seed, even though it's a perennial. I think the seed is how it's spreading. There's some little bit of creep vegetatively, but mostly by seed. So it can take over, and also known to be allelopathic, meaning that it's got some sort of chemical that exudes out of the plant that prevents the germination, let's say, of bluestem, for instance. That's been proven.
The lead question is, can it be corralled? Can one rid of it or keep it from spreading further? You'll be expanding on this at the conference coming up next Tuesday, but in a very basic sense, what can be done?
Yeah, we've been looking at ways of trying to control or manage it, and I think it depends somewhat on the situation in terms of how much you might have. If it's just starting to show up in scattered stands here and there, The main chemistry that we've found that we can spray it with and try to control it are glyphosate, the active ingredient in a lot of our Roundup products then, and then a chemical called imazapyr, which the primary trade name there is arsenal. But those two products, most people are familiar with glyphosate. It's pretty non-selective. Yeah. But if you just had a small patch, you can go out and treat that with glyphosate and at 2 to 3 pound sort of a rate. One shot's not going to get it all. It will come back from probably a few crowns that survived and or from seed bank. And at this point, we aren't real sure how long that might last. So I'm thinking maybe 4 or 5 years, though. But eventually, the seed should be gone in terms of its ability to germinate. And, other plants, Mother Nature will fill in those spots. In scattered stands, though, what we found the advantage of using a relatively low rate of the imazapyr, and we're talking about a 1/4 to 1/2 pound rate on a per acre basis, is it's a lot more selective. That the native grasses, by and large, tend to tolerate that lower rate of that product compared to glyphosate. And so, where I've treated primarily here in the eastern part of the state where we have bluestems and Indian grass, those sort of species, they tend to survive that application. So if I don't have a real high cover of the Old World Bluestem, and by high I'm talking about 50% or more cover, there's usually enough native grass there that if it's lower than that, and when I spray, I knock back the Old World Bluestem, and the native grasses survive and can increase over time. So that's one approach if you have to have that situation. When it's really dense, then you got to decide what are you going to do. Yeah. A lot of these areas that are real dense may have been formerly cropland, and maybe it got planted there. Maybe, I think in the soil bank days, it's kind of a precursor to CRP, but in the late 50s, early 60s, there are places in Kansas where it was Old World Bluestems were planted. And, you still run into those, and people try to manage and utilize them the best they can. But if they wanted to go back to something different, in those cases, I think you could go back and till it up. I might burn it off and then spray the new growth. The fire in the spring doesn't seem to hurt it too much. It usually survives that, but, get it green growth coming, spray it with glyphosate, till it, maybe go to a summer annual or something like that for a while, or to a Roundup ready crop. We got, even alfalfa, but soybeans and corn, those alfalfa Roundup resistant varieties are available. That, again, some of that Old World Bluestem will continue to come up for a while, but if you're treating with Roundup for, at least probably once a year for a while, eventually you should get rid of it, and then you can go back to, if you want to go back to a native grasses, you could do that. But initially, I think, you need to take care of the Old World Bluestem before you try planting native.
You need to map out a plan as a producer contending with Old World Bluestem. That's the point here. And that's what you'll be sharing at the conference coming up this Tuesday. And it's not too late for those who would like to take this program in. You're accepting walk-ups at the door, Walt.
Yes, people are, I know our pre-registration deadline is passed, but, everybody's still welcome to come and join us at the conference in Wichita.
There is a fee involved, registration $60 per farm. That will include the noon meal and some other perks that you'll want to take advantage of. Again, it's taking place this coming Tuesday, the 10th of December, at the Sedgwick County Extension Education Center. That's located on West 21st Street in Wichita. It's very easy to find. If you'd like more information, you can go to this website, ksfgc.org, ksfgc.org. Walt, thanks for previewing it and for the thoughts on dealing with Old World Bluestem right here.
Thanks, Eric.
Walt Fick, Range and Pasture Management Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. This is Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And now today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, in a sign that U.S. agriculture may start to see greater access to China, the Chinese Finance Ministry announced this morning it would start excluding some soybeans, pork, and other agricultural goods from tariffs. In a posted statement on its website, the ministry stated, due to domestic needs, Chinese companies will be allowed to, quote here, import certain quantities of goods from the United States through market-based procurement. No quantity levels were specified for the tariff waiver in that brief statement. This move comes as a December the 15th deadline approaches when new 15% tariffs from the U.S. begin on $160 billion worth of Chinese goods. The U.S. and China right now are still, of course, trying to reach a Phase 1 deal. Chinese officials have called for the U.S. to reduce or eliminate tariffs already in place as part of those talks. Now, a spokesman for the Chinese Ministry of Commerce had said earlier this week that tariffs should be reduced accordingly as part of the interim deal. Pork exports to China right now face a normal 12% duty and 60% retaliatory tariffs, while soybean exports to China face a 25% tariff. Before the tariff wars hit in July of last year, soybean sales were hitting about $14 billion a year in value, but soybean exports dropped precipitously after those tariffs were set and China began importing more aggressively from South American countries. The move on soybeans allows China to take better advantage of lower U.S. prices and higher stocks following the U.S. harvest. Also, of course, affecting China right now, African swine fever that has eliminated as much as half of China's overall swine herd and sow population. Since midsummer in China, the price of pork has soared, and China has increased its U.S. pork purchases despite its own tariffs. For this year, the U.S. has exported more than 302,000 metric tons of pork to China and still has outstanding sales of 127,000 metric tons. Through October, the U.S. Meat Export Federation shows pork sales to China had reached a high of 974 million. That would be up 34% from a year ago. Now, a spokesperson for the National Pork Producers Council, Rachel Gantz, said that the NPPC welcomes the reports, and ideally this will translate into higher sales in the short term. The NPPC had just released a report highlighting that U.S. pork production could double if China removed all tariffs. The USDA is set to open sign-up for the Conservation Reserve Program this Monday to include both general and continuous enrollments, according to an announcement from the Farm Service Agency. Here's more from the USDA's Rod Bain.
The general sign-up period begins Monday for USDA's Conservation Reserve Program. But Farm Service Agency Administrator Richard Fordyce, talking with reporters Thursday, said not only that.
The announcement that we are going to initiate sign-up for both general and continuous CRP beginning on December 9th.
The general CRP sign-up is the first since 2015-16 and will run through February 28th. Coinciding with acreage enrollment in various continuous CRP offerings. Also set to take place next year, an enrollment period for CRP grasslands and a rollout of 2 pilot programs within CRP, all part of the program's 35th anniversary year. FSA Assistant Deputy Administrator Brad Carbon adds, while there is not yet a specific cap number for enrolled acres in the general sign-up, with 7 million eligible acres available for enrollment in various CRP programs.
This could be the largest sign-up we've had in over 10 years. We anticipate plenty of room for continuous, general, and CREP.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Well, you producers and anyone else with a stake in the Kansas wheat industry can show your support for this vital sector of Kansas agriculture. Jordan Hildebrand explains how on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Jordan?
As you are making your end-of-the-year tax plans, we ask you to consider making a tax-deductible donation of cash to the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation to further wheat research efforts at the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center. Or, better yet, how about donating an acre of wheat or a truckload of wheat to the KWCRF. All donations are used to further the mission of Kansas State University's wheat breeding program, ensuring that Kansas farmers have access to the best possible wheat varieties and that scientists can leverage human, financial, and laboratory resources to make significant improvements to wheat genetics. The Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation differs from the Wheat Checkoff. The Checkoff does fund wheat research, but it is also used for marketing, promotion, and education. Donations to the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation will be used only for wheat research and only at Kansas State University. The end of the year is a great time to donate wheat to the KWC Research Foundation. For many cash-basis farmers, significant tax savings can be achieved by donating crops grown directly to a charitable organization. Cash charitable contributions are deductible only as an itemized deduction from adjusted gross income, which results in reducing federal income tax only. By contributing crops to a charitable organization, a farmer can avoid including the sale of the cash crop in income and can still deduct the cost of growing the crop, which results in saving self-employment tax, federal income tax, and state income tax. A farmer can give a grain donation by giving up ownership of the grain. A gift should be made from unsold crop inventory with no prior sale commitment made prior to the gift. A farmer will then gift the grain to the charitable organization and let them decide what to do with it and when to sell it. A letter to the charitable organization summarizing the source of the gift from the farmer and an acknowledgement of the gift by the charitable organization should be kept on file. This may be needed to serve as a substitute for a sales receipt in the yield verification process at FSA offices and crop insurance on the quantity of gifted grain, since the grain sales documents would not be in the name of the farmer, but rather in the name of the charitable organization. Depending on the size of your gift, a number of donor recognition opportunities exist. All will be displayed in the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center so that you, your children, and your grandchildren will see that your gift played a major role in shaping the bright future of Kansas wheat production. The Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation was established in 2011 as the official research fundraising organization for the Kansas Wheat Commission. It is a separate, independent entity chartered by the state of Kansas as a 501c3 nonprofit research corporation. Gifts to the Research Foundation are used solely for the purpose of funding wheat research. Gifts to the foundation are tax deductible to the full extent of the law. A volunteer board governs the foundation. To learn more about the Kansas Wheat Commission Research Foundation or just wheat research in general, please visit kansaswheat.org. For Kansas Wheat, this is Jordan Hildebrand.
Thanks, Jordan, and we'll be back shortly. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned to Agriculture Today, and to cap off this edition, Kansas agricultural weather, and the very latest from the Weather Data Library here at K-State. Joining us is Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp with the wrap-up on the month of November, Mary. So pass along the numbers if you would, but the trends were to the cool and the dry side, to no one's shock.
Right. Probably what will surprise people the most is if you look at percent of normal precipitation, our wet spot was actually northwest Kansas. They average 0.62 of an inch of precip. Not a lot, but at least it was something. And that was 76% of normal. The area of the state that had the most in total volume was the southeast. They averaged 1.13 inches. 44% of normal. They typically see more during the winter months, and they just did not get it. If you're talking dry, it will come as no surprise that the Southwest continues to lead the race in dryness. They were averaging 0.17 of an inch, and that was 26% of normal.
And as the month went, it was cooler than normal, you say?
Right. We averaged 39.7 degrees, which is just a shade under 3 degrees cooler than normal, 2.9 to be exact. The Northwest was the warmest, with an average of 37.3, which was 1.2 degrees cooler than normal. When you look at the cold side, the Southeast was the coldest, again looking at departure from normal. They averaged 41.5 degrees, but that was 4.4 degrees cooler than they would typically see.
Just opposite of what would be the norm, Mary.
Right. That's it. That is it exactly. It's flipping what we would typically expect, where typically you would expect the Northwest to be the cooler and drier and the Southeast to be the warmer and wetter. And we just kind of flipped that pattern. It should be noted that everybody got really, really cold, and people will remember the system that passed through on the 11th and 12th of November. -5 was our coldest reading in west central Kansas, just to the southwest of Oakley. All of the western divisions saw sub-zero temperatures in that outbreak. When you get to the southeast, they did get down into those single digits, and so the lowest temperature reported in southeastern Kansas was 3 degrees. Should be noted also that we did get on the warm side. That was right in advance of that cold spell that we had on the 11th and 12th. The warmest readings for the month were on the 10th, and they ranged from 86 in west central Kansas to 74 in northeastern Kansas. A 91-degree temperature swing in about 3 days.
It's what we do in Kansas, it seems, periodically anyway. But November did set us up for a spreading of dryness, and the drought monitor would reflect that expansion.
Right. The U.S. drought monitor in the month of November, we went from some moderate drought to now we have some extreme drought in southwestern Kansas. The abnormally dry expanded across most of the western divisions and into the central and south central divisions. Most of the dryness has come in the last quarter. The September to November numbers are where we're really seeing that dryness. And so the impacts are being felt in two major areas. One is in that any fall planted crops have had difficulty getting established, particularly, again, we're talking winter wheat and canola. The second area of impact is the increasing fire danger. We've got a lot of fuel that has dried to tinder dry conditions, so it doesn't take much to get it started. And if you have the kind of frontal passages that we've had with very strong winds, that means that they can take off and move in an explosive manner if you've got any fire started. The other problem that comes with these frontal passages is you can have a shifting wind pattern. Mm-hmm. So you start out with the winds out of the south, they move to the west, and they're coming out of the northwest, and that can all happen within a day, which again makes any kind of fire control very difficult.
And we can't stress that threat too much here because these light moisture events aren't going to relieve that situation at all.
No, and when they're talking about these fire danger things, they're quite often talking about 1-hour fuels. That means that the fuels that they're talking about, the grasses and the fine debris, can dry down in an hour. So if you have a rain event, that doesn't really suppress that danger for long.
So when is our next opportunity for moisture likely?
We're looking at a system coming through Monday into Tuesday. Should note that out in west central Kansas, they actually had some moisture overnight, but it was confined in a relatively small area. But again, we're looking at a chance as we start the week. It also is interesting to note that the Climate Prediction Center's outlook for the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 both favor wetter than normal conditions across much of the state. Again, the caveat that wetter than normal at this time of the year, particularly in the western and central parts of the state where drought is the most entrenched, doesn't translate to a whole lot of moisture. In western Kansas, it's as little as 1/100 of an inch a day. So getting wetter than normal will slow any further development of the drought, but it's unlikely to make major inroads on the conditions that are already in place.
And you say cooler temperatures are ahead.
Right. They are forecasting cooler than normal temperatures for most of the state. The western third is on the edge. It's likely to be equal chances for above or below normal. It will probably depend upon how quickly the various frontal systems progress through. When you get those, you tend to have downsloping winds on the rear side of that front, and that will warm things up in the west, but it generally doesn't penetrate into the central and eastern parts of the state.
Well, Mary, we'll see what this next week brings, and we appreciate the input. Thank you. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Eric.
Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension, along with us each Friday right here. And we bid you a good weekend likewise. Thanks for tuning in, and please be back with us right here on Monday, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.